Please welcome RFA's Vice President of Industry Relations, Robert White.
I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker. I hope everyone in the room already knows him. He is a staunch advocate for alternative fuels. Mr. Marc Rauch is an award-winning TV film writer, producer, and director. In 1987, he co-founded the Auto Channel television network and then the AutoChannel.com a few years later. The AutoChannel.com is the internet's largest and oldest information resource with more than 1.5 million pages of content. Marc is a leading advocate of alternative fuels and energy, writing, lecturing, and making numerous broadcast appearances regarding these issues. Marc travels the globe to make what you are about to experience, and I ask that you please help me welcome to the stage Mr. Marc Rauch.
Good morning, and happy Valentine's Day to everyone. To paraphrase Star Trek's Mr. Spock, I'd like to say and wish you and hope that you will love long and prosper. But it's great to be here. It's great to be here in Texas, this beautiful hotel, the great state of Texas, which is, of course, the belly of the beast of the oil industry. And what I'm hoping to share with you in the next few minutes will be information that will give that beast a very sore, big bellyache. And as you know, in Texas, everything is bigger, so hopefully it'll be really big. But before I start with my main presentation, I'd like to provide some breaking news. I always like to start with breaking news. So today is the 16,167th consecutive day since the October 73 oil crisis, in which not one U.S. serviceman or woman has been killed defending ethanol production or distribution. That deserves a round of applause. Yeah, that's a big number. So, a few weeks ago, I was surfing the internet, as I do, and I came across a website produced by the American Petroleum Institute called filluponfacts.com. And what I found were not facts. What I found were lies. What I found were misrepresentations, gross exaggerations. Now, I thought to myself, well, you know, I could answer this just by citing any one of the papers that I've written over the years, any one of the articles I've written. And the lies and the various things that they talk about on this site is how ethanol damages engines, it has less power, creates less mileage, makes more pollution, things like that. And I thought to myself, well, I could do that. I could just say, see my editorial of, September 2006 or 7 or 8 or something like that. But I thought, nah, I don't want to do that. I want to do something a little different. I want to find something else. So I went out on the internet and I looked for other things that people said, things that other people have talked about with ethanol. And I found some really exciting, great things. And I thought so that's what I would start to talk about. And I thought that for this presentation, I'd sort of create it into a little bit of a game show, right? So I'm going to show you some of these things that I found that I didn't write, that RFA didn't write and talk about, that American Coalition of Ethanol didn't talk about, Glacial Lakes didn't talk about, POET didn't talk about, various other groups didn't talk about, Pacific Ethanol never said. But I found all these things, and I thought I would present them to you. And this is what they said. So these are great statements, right? These are things that, look, this is what you all came to this conference to hear and for us to talk about and to see and to applaud and to be excited about, that this is ethanol. And so I said, I got to share this with you guys. Okay. So who said these things? As I said, I didn't say them. These aren't statements that I actually wrote. These aren't statements that RFA wrote. You know, these aren't sort of from there. So who wrote these things? Was it the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen? No, it couldn't have been, because that's a movie with Sean Connery, and so they wouldn't have talked about this, right? No, that's not it. Was it the Association for Astrological Networking? You know, in other words, did somebody read this on their palm, all these statements on their palm of their hand? Or did they read it in tea leaves at the bottom of a cup? No, that's not where it came from. So did it come from the Council of California Philatelic Societies? And for those of you who don't know, that means stamp collectors. So did stamp collectors say these things? Nah, they're busy collecting stamps. Okay. Was it the petroleum industry? Now, how could the petroleum industry have said all of those very great statements? Because we know that the petroleum industry for years has been bashing ethanol. How terrible they talk about ethanol, how they make it that it's the worst thing to use, right? So could it be the petroleum industry said these things?
That's right.
Wow. They said that. They said these things. And so it turns out that in my research, that really for more than 50 years, about 60 years, about 70 years almost, the petroleum industry, mostly in England, France, Germany, a few other countries, Brazil, well, they talked up ethanol. They talked up ethanol blends. They made it that it was the greatest thing in the world. They used blends that were E10 to E30, and these were the greatest things. Now, the two primary companies who did this in England was one called Cleveland Discol Petrol, and there's an interesting reason why it's called Cleveland Discol Petrol. I won't go into that now, but that company basically was a Standard Oil-owned company. Standard Oil, for many years known as Esso or Mobil, and of course Esso today is Exxon. And the other big company that used it, American company at that time, was City Service, which today is known as Citgo. And they operated under a brand name of Cool Motor Petrol. So they said these great things. Well, where did they say these great things about ethanol? Well, in the 1930s, these are some examples of some of the ads. Now, it may be hard for you to read here, but hopefully you'll get a copy of this presentation and you'll look at these closer. But what these things talk about is all of the things I listed, that ethanol is the best fuel. It has more power. It delivers more miles. It cleans the engines. It is better for the environment. Now, this is counter to everything we have heard in America about ethanol and about ethanol blends. So that was the 1930s. 1940s, continued. 1950s, more, right? These are sample ads, actual ads that ran in England. And by the way, while this was all happening, in France and in Germany, they were using blends that were even higher. And in other countries, well, take Brazil. We think of Brazil today as, we all know that the standard gasoline, the standard fuel in Brazil is about an E27. But that's not new. Brazil actually was using ethanol blends as early as the 1940s. So they've done these things. So this is the 50s. Well, 60s, continue with some ads.
Cleveland Discol, the petrol with alcohol.
Well, I know there's alcohol in it, and I reckon it gives me a clean engine.
Well, it certainly runs very cleanly, and I never have any trouble.
One can play around buying brand this and brand that and brand the other, but
And I have done myself, but I come back to the store.
I run fairly high-performance cars, and I find that they always be good performance.
And I'm perfectly delighted with the petrol.
You try it. Cleveland Discol, the petrol with alcohol.
That was an ad that ran in England for the Cleveland Disco. And as you can hear, the guys are talking about how great it is, right? How much power, how it's so much better, how it's cleaner, and so on. Well, not only did that happen in England, in the United States, we had one of our most famous comedians of all time, Bob Hope, do an ad for Texaco.
What's Texaco doing in a field of corn? Not growing it. Texaco's making gasohol. It's a mixture of 90% Texaco unleaded gasoline and 10% ethanol made from renewable crops like corn. Gasohol can't replace gasoline, but it can help stretch our available supply, and Texaco's selling gasohol in a number of states right now. Gasohol, one of the ways Texaco is working to keep your trust.
Now, I added those little bumper stickers on the side because I thought that they were funny, particularly funny, especially the top one, the green one. It says, "Tomorrow's fuel today." Now, imagine, I mean, that's something that RFA would have in an ad, right? That some of the other ethanol groups would have. Something I would have in an ad or in a headline. But they were saying that 40 years ago, in the United States. So that was Texaco. Up in Canada, here's an ad from Canada.
Manitoba, spirited people on the go in every season and running better with E10 Gasohol from Mohawk. All cars, old or new, benefit from Gasohol's higher octane rating, especially in warm weather. Mohawk Gasohol reduces harmful engine deposits and eliminates knock, ping, and run-on, and lets Manitoba drive cleaner with reduced exhaust emissions. E10 Gasohol, unleaded and regular, only in Manitoba, only from Mohawk.
Now, if you just landed on the planet and you happened to walk in to these doors and you saw this presentation, you would say, "My God, this has got to be the greatest fuel ever." And of course, it is the greatest fuel ever. Ethanol is the best fuel for internal combustion engines. It has always been the best fuel. It is only because of a lot of lies that we've been put behind the 8 ball. But this is what we've seen. So I think that this is pretty convincing evidence, right? It's pretty interesting to see. It's pretty interesting to see that the oil industry that had been lying to Americans for all these years about ethanol actually was their biggest supporter around the world. Now I thought to myself, I said, if these ethanol blends were used for all these years in these countries, so then thousands of cars must have used ethanol blends. Not thousands, tens of thousands. But not tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of cars were using ethanol blends for all these years. Well, if we look at the bad press that the oil industry has given us and told us about ethanol, we should say, gosh, there must have been millions of cars that were really damaged by ethanol. So I went back to the internet and I did a search, because before I wanted to publish this story, I wanted to find all of the stories that were going to talk about how bad ethanol was, all the bad experiences. I figured, if there were 1 million cars that used this, there had to be 10,000 stories that were negative about ethanol. Well, at least 1,000 stories. Well, a couple of hundred, right? There should have been a couple of hundred stories from 50 years worth of use of ethanol blends. A dozen. There had to be a dozen stories, right? Well, I found no stories. There were no such stories. The only stories that talk about ethanol possibly being bad are recent stories, rather recent stories, from the last decade, 15 years, 20 years, something like that. But nothing that goes back to all of these days. So I thought, wow, that's really strange. But okay, I'm writing this article, and I'm just about to publish it on the Auto Channel, and I'm just about to send it out on my email blast that I do to my email list. Many of you in the audience probably, or may, I hope, are getting that email. Well, just before I pushed the Magic Twanga Froggy to make that happen, by the way, Magic Twanga Froggy is an old reference if you ever saw the Andy Devine show with, no, you don't know that. Okay, all right. I must be too old for the room. But anyway, so just before I pushed the magic button, I said, let me look one more time for some stories that were going to be negative about ethanol. Well, what I found, and these are, again, just to recap, these are the things that the petroleum oil industry said about ethanol, all the great, wonderful things. So just before I send the story, I go in and I look for some, as I say, some negative stories. I didn't find negative stories. So I found, here's one story. This is from an automotive magazine in England in 1934. And this talks about the ethanol blends. And this basically is repeating what I just showed you, that alcohol blends are better. Better for performance, better for mileage, better to clean the engines, better for the environment, so on and so forth. Cheaper, and so on. I found another story, or another report. This was a report done in 2014. And this report went and looked back at what took place in Europe in the 1930s, and it basically just recaps the fact that ethanol blends were sold in those days. And it doesn't, there's nothing negative in it, and the only thing it does is that it points, in some places in the report, to the positive stories, again, about ethanol blends being better for high compression cars, which basically was any real passenger car, and how it's better, how it's cheaper, more powerful, so on and so forth. So, okay, I had these stories. And then just before I went to press, it was late at night. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning. My wife's waiting for me to come to bed. She waits every night because I have erratic sleeping habits. But I'm just about to push the button, and I thought, you know what, let me look one more time to see if I could find a historical story talking about how ethanol destroys engines. Didn't find it. But what I did find was this. A report that just came out in September 2017. So it's only a few months ago. And I hadn't seen this report. So it surprised me, because I like to think that I sort of, either I find stuff or stuff gets sent to me by everybody. And I thought I would have seen this, but I hadn't. So I went through this. And this is a report done by the National Renewable Energy Laboratories, one of the government labs, one of the United States government labs. And they went and did this study to look at what took place in 2004, 2005, and 2003 to 2005. And the reason for doing this was because those were the years when there was a lot of complaints about ethanol blends, and it happens to tie in right with the years of RFS getting started and so on. And they were wondering, well, the problems that occurred, so with all the new conversation now about E15 and higher blends, E30, E25, E40, is it possible that the problems cited in those years of 2003 to 2005, are those problems going to reemerge? Well, what they found was, no, those problems are not reemerging. And in fact, really after 2003 to 2005, we stopped getting these reports. But what they found was that there were these sulfate salts in the fuel, in the blends. Now, they had no idea how those sulfate salts got there. So they surmise in the report. They think, well, it could have happened just in the distillation process for ethanol. Well, it could have happened in the blending process between the gasoline and the ethanol. Well, it could have happened because of something that was in the tanks at the service stations, the filling stations, or the tanks at the blenders that created these problems. And that it was these salts that was the bottom line to what had happened. But they're not sure. But of course, what they talk about here is that, well, you know, it's a great possibility that these things were by accident, right? Accidents happen. Or that somebody actually did it intentionally. Now, I don't know. I have no proof. I've seen no proof to say that Harry Jones, working for a particular oil company, went over to a tank and put something into that tank that was being blended with ethanol. I don't know that. I haven't seen that. If anybody has that information, I'd love to see it. I don't know. All I could say is that they offer that as a distinct possibility. And all I could say is that in looking at the oil industry, I have long compared it to the tobacco industry. And the tobacco industry has had a great history, or not a great history, let's call it an infamous history, of screwing around with the formulations of their cigarettes to make them more addictive, right? They've done things to the nicotine. We know that they have hired media personalities and doctors and professors, some really high credentialed people, to write stories, to write reports for them and talk about how smoking really isn't bad and how, whoa, gosh, if you have this filter, it's going to make things so much better. Or the really famous ads with doctors that talked about how 9 out of 10 or 8 out of 10 doctors prefer to smoke a particular type of cigarette. Well, of course, that's all nonsense. But that's the playbook of the tobacco industry. And what I found and what I did document last summer in another paper that I wrote, some of those same professors and doctors who wrote some of those stories for the tobacco industry to defend tobacco are today writing about how bad ethanol is and how much better gasoline is. So all that I know is that they're using plays from the same playbook. And so, as I say, it could be a coincidence that that stuff happened. Personally, I don't think it's a coincidence. I think it was intentional, but I'm going to leave that up to you and to everybody else until we find the proof. Anyway, that's my story. I'm sticking to it. But that's my conclusion, and I think that this information has to be put out there. And we have to remember to keep going back and to keep saying that the same oil industry that has been bad-mouthing ethanol for all these years and standing in the way and using all of their money to sidetrack ethanol from greater acceptance, that all of these things are nonsense because the oil industry themselves have said that ethanol blends are the best fuel for internal combustion engines. Cleaner, better performing, more miles, less expensive, better for the environment, and of course, better for the health. So in closing, in conclusion, I'll leave you with something that I always say, and that is, I'd rather have my fuel money go to American farmers than to foreign dictators and terrorists. So thank you very much. If anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.